Anti-derivative Jill.
Hello, I'm Anti-Derivative Jill, and I'm here to talk to you today about the absolutely legendary Doug Drexler and how he says he was disenfranchised during his work on Star Trek Picard Season 3. I love his work so much, so I thought this might be fun to talk about. And also, I made this video to thank Stoneracket. Thank you to Stoneracket. Before I get deeper into the video, here's some thank you cats. Thank you for becoming a member, Stoneracket. Thanks again, Stoneracket, and I hope you like this video.
You are great. I am great.
I normally don't create content on Stino, Star Trek in name only, which I first heard from Clobby from Clobbering Times. Make sure you're subscribed to him. I could think of no better name to call it, really. If you like it, that's all right. But for me, Star Trek it ended in 2005. But here I am today doing just that. So, I had some thoughts a while back while I was watching the Star Trek podcast that Dominic Keating and Connor Trenier have called the Shuttle Pod Show, where they interview the fabulous Doug Drexler. I thank them so much for giving me so much to think about. So make sure you're following that podcast. I'll put the link in the description so you can find it. Like I said, I normally don't cover individual episodes regarding non-Star Trek. However, Doug Drexler is a man that I respect and admire, even more so every time I listen to him talk. And yet he has a very different explanation for all of this. Admittedly, his view is much kinder and gentler than mine. And even though his opinion is kinder, I think that it's an extremely valid opinion as a Star Trek fan. First off, though, he said some amazing things about story continuity, and the whole chat full of people who seem to embrace what is labeled as Trek past 2005 seem to be okay with messing with canon by pointing out the fact that the original series wasn't consistent within itself. That it didn't even stick to its own canon. But this argument doesn't fly with me because TOS was creating the canon. So the responsibility for consistency is on the following creations, The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and I think that's important. And I think most of the inconsistency that they're talking about happened during the corporate season in season 3. But that's another story. Maybe we can have more videos talking about stuff like that later. And for a while, during the early portions of the interview, it seemed like the panel didn't even realize that Doug had worked on Picard season 3. However, eventually they were clued in. And I can understand why, because even when I watched that garbage, I didn't see his name or Michael Okuda in the credits. I think in the interview, he said he didn't want to take away from the other creators on the show, that's nice of him. But his work and Michael Okuda's are the only reason some bits and pieces of that season resemble Star Trek visually in any way. Their ships and designs get way more lighting, for one thing, than the interior of the ship. So again, the panel finally realizes that Doug worked on Picard, and we get this amazing bit. It seems like every time he hits the main points of what makes Star Trek special, we get a little bit of an interruption from the panel, but I do get there excited to talk to him. I'm going to read what Doug Drexler says myself, so that if you want to hear him say these words, you need to go check out the Shuttle Pod show. Some good stuff. Because I don't want to take away from Connor and Dominic's work too. I respect them as well because they put on killer karaoke parties at the Star Trek conventions. So clearly they care about and love the fans. And so if you'd like to hear Doug Drexler say all of these things in his own voice, make sure to go check out that interview. I'll put the link in the description below. Anyway, Doug Drexler says, well, the thing was that there was a period where Michael Okuda and myself and Denise, we were kind of disenfranchised. They didn't want anyone who knew too much about. Obviously, he was going to say Star Trek, but then Connor interrupts. But luckily, Doug continues. I'm so glad. I'm just so happy with the way that Doug just keeps on going. He's amazing. Doug Drexler says, they didn't want anyone who knew too much about Star Trek. Well, they wanted to do their own thing. They don't want to be told that the original series ship is 947 feet. They say, I want it to be 3,000 feet long, you know? Fans love the continuity. That's one of the great things about Star Trek, and I agree. And it's true, we do. Then Dominic tries to interrupt, and Doug continues. It's just that Star Trek is a period piece. But then someone interrupts again, so I don't catch the next sentence. It was probably great. He was saying something about the future. But then I catch up. Then Doug says, part of the charm of Star Trek is that it all ties together. All the threads tie together until, and here it is. Here's what Doug says. All the threads tie together until J.J. Abrams did the first Star Trek movie. And he basically did it. See, he doesn't understand that because he's not a Star Trek geek. He's a Star Wars kid, really. I mean, you can be both, but I saw. And so we all know this story that he's about to tell. This is the story where where J.J. Abrams talks to Jon Stewart on the Daily Show, and all of you guys know this story. So this part of the interview, I will skip it just because you guys have seen it before, where JJ says, I've never really liked Star Trek. I've always hated it when they would get philosophical and stuff. Okay, and then Doug says, and that's like a knife in my heart. That's what I love about the show, that it would take a stand and get philosophical. And Jon Stewart said, I stopped listening when you said you didn't like Star Trek. So I'm still listening to Doug Drexler talk, and I keep loving how he doesn't stop for questions. He just keeps on moving because he is completely awesome and he's the best. I think this part is funny because Dominic, he has never heard that story before. I thought everybody heard it before. But Doug continues and talks about, I suppose now, his work on Star Trek The Next Generation, because he starts to talk about Herman Zimmerman, who worked as a production designer for real Star Trek. The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and 6 of the Star Trek movies. So Doug Drexler says, I understand, I've said this before, when you bring in, for Herman Zimmerman, it was important. And of course, you had Gene Roddenberry there, who wanted to connect to the old show. People were hired who knew the show. And that's key. For real Star Trek, you've got to hire people who know the show. Thank you, Doug. That is beautiful. That is exactly what every fan wants to hear when they hear about a Star Trek project being made, is that someone who knows it is working on it. Then Doug says, me and Mike and Denise knew that show inside and out. I totally understand that they bring in the production designer. Okay, Doug says, me, Mike, and Denise knew that show inside and out. I totally understand that they bring in a production designer who wants to make his own mark on it. And this production designer, and okay, so this is where I stop listening and I go and I look up who the production designer was on Star Trek Picard season 3, because I had no idea. Doug didn't want to say his name, probably out of kindness, but It was David Blass, who was also the production designer on season 2. Doug says that the production designer for this show had this attitude about real Star Trek. And the approximate quote of David Blass's attitude was, "I thought the show was kind of cheap looking. I want to do something completely different." That's the problem with Steino Productions. They don't want to be Star Trek. And the only reason it half looked a little bit kind of right in some places was in any work that you saw from Michael Okuda or Doug Drexler. Kurtzman Trek had spent so much time trying to not be Star Trek that when they finally realize that they have to, you still have the vestiges of the previous film dragging all the attempts to make it Trek down. And this is why everything on that show was so dark and dreary. Doug continues this amazing insight. Okay, so here's Doug talking again. That was me. You have people out there who have been fans of the show for decades. They have the books, they've memorized it. They can tell you when things happen and how it happened. They have blueprints. They know the layout of the ship and the way it works. And now you're telling me that all that was for nothing? And they get angry. On the other hand, I understand a production designer who isn't particularly a geek. And if you don't get it, you don't get it. I understand that they want to put their spin on it or maybe even fix it. But that's just a huge mistake with Star Trek. And so, um, yeah, I absolutely agree. I've always loved Doug Drexler, and the world first learned about his love of Star Trek when he was just 14 years old and he became part of the letter writing campaign that helped Star Trek, the original series, get its 3rd season. So he really gets it. However, this is the moment where he figures out something about Steino and presents it in a way that is unabashedly kind to it. It pays it the respect that I don't really think it deserves, which is very good of him, out of respect for all the people who work on it. But he does it in a way that you get the sense that he still really loves Star Trek, the real stuff. So Doug says, Star Trek has spun in so many different directions now. Picard is not, in my opinion, in the same universe with Discovery. Strange New Worlds is not the same universe. I love that he said this because, of course, I've always said NuTrek is not in the same universe as 66 to 2005, and that if Kurtzman could just admit that Secret Hideout is creating all of these separate universes, each series is its own pocket universe, we could clean up house over at Memory Alpha. Since he won't, Memory Alpha is a mess. Since Kurtzman shoves all of this new Trek all together into Star Trek, all of the fan lore on Memory Alpha is all corrupted. You have to really know what you're looking at in order to filter the filth out of the good information of good Star Trek. But Doug is taking that idea even further. He's saying that each new Trek show itself is its own universe. That is how different each show is. He continues. Okay, so Doug says, ultimately, what I finally had, I just think it's kind of what happened with Marvel. Star Trek became a multiverse. And so that's what I wanted to share from Doug Drexler's interview over at the Shuttlepod show. There was one more thing in the interview that I was able to catch that I wanted to share. And I'll leave you guys with this. Doug wanted to sell a cookbook of his wife's recipes with an Enterprise theme because she worked on the food on that show. But someone somewhere, he doesn't say who, said, "Why do we want a book about a show that's not on anymore?" And that to me is ridiculous. If they could, they were able to let Neelix have a cookbook, then Doug's wife should have one too. Seriously, if that is just one way we can repay all of the wonderful work that Doug has given to us, to let him share with us the food that his wife created with that Star Trek theme, then I think we owe it to him at least. And I think that any Star Trek fan would just love to make her recipes. Whomever it is that said no, I have no idea who said no to him, but whoever said no, please reconsider. They probably won't watch this anyway. So whomever said no, if you are watching this, realize that Star Trek fans would love to bring a little bit of Star Trek family recipes into our homes. Anyway, this is a great place to stop and say, once again, thank you to Stoneracket. Thank you for becoming a channel member and inspiring me to put more work into this channel. You're the best. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.